Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human researched and written material.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, so imagine walking into just a massive gold-plated temple right in the center of the ancient world's most powerful empire.
Oh, wow, right in the thick of it.
Exactly. And you're, standing in the shadows and you watch the high priests meticulously lay out an offering on this grand table.
A huge offering, I assume.
Huge. Like 54 gallons of fine wine and the butchered meat of 40 sheep.
That's not a small snack.
No, it's a feast. And then the heavy bronze doors swing shut and the emperor himself seals the lock with his royal ring.
High security.
Right. But by morning, the seal is completely untouched, but every drop of wine and every single scrap of meat is it's gone.
Completely vanished.
Yeah. So the question is, are you witnessing the terrifying, supernatural appetite of a living God? Or are you looking at the greatest, longest-running institutional heist ever recorded?
I love that framing. It really sets the stakes.
Well, thanks. Because that is the exact puzzle facing the protagonist in the text we are diving into today.
It really is.
We're focusing exclusively on the Apocrypha today, placing our magnifying glass entirely over this ancient, really highly unusual piece of literature known as Bel and the Dragon.
Such a fascinating text.
It is. And if you are listening to this, you likely already have, a baseline understanding of ancient texts and how they function.
Right. Our listeners know their stuff.
They do. But this specific narrative is just uniquely practical. We aren't here to just recount an old fable.
No, absolutely not.
We are acting as your guides to extract the very real structural wisdom hidden inside this locked room mystery.
Because that's what it is, a mystery.
It is. Because beneath the giant statues and the trapdoors, this text is essentially, a survival manual. A manual for navigating institutional deception, cultural assimilation, and honestly, visceral fear.
It absolutely is a survival manual.
Right.
And, the way it goes about teaching these lessons is radically different from what you might expect from, standard ancient religious literature.
How so? Structurally, what are we looking at?
Well, structurally, the stories of Bel and the Dragon are additions to the Book of Daniel.
Okay.
If you look at the Latin Vulgate, they actually constitute the 14th chapter.
The 14th chapter, right.
Yeah. But in most modern Protestant structures, they are separated out into the Apocrypha.
Which changes how people read them, I guess.
Yeah, it does. But the textual history itself is, it's like a detective story that kind of mirrors the actual narrative of the text.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. So they survive today primarily in two ancient Greek manuscript traditions.
Greek, okay.
Right. The Septuagint, which, was the translation of the Hebrew Bible for Greek-speaking Jews.
Sure.
And then there's a later revised Greek version by a scholar named Theodotion.
Okay, but the scholarly consensus is that they weren't natively written in Greek, correct?
Exactly.
The textual archaeology points to a lost original, doesn't it?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the way scholars deduce this is it's a fascinating exercise in linguistic forensics.
I love linguistic forensics.
Right, because when you read the Greek texts deeply, you immediately notice a profound friction in the syntax.
Friction, like it just doesn't flow right.
Yeah, the grammar is technically Greek, but the soul of the sentence structure is entirely Hebrew.
Oh, that's really interesting.
We call these Hebraisms.
Hebraisms. Okay, let's dig into the mechanics of that.
Sure.
What exactly does a Hebraism look like in this context? Because Greek and Hebrew organize thought in, fundamentally different ways.
They really do. Classical Greek heavily utilizes what we call hypotaxis.
Hypotaxis.
Yeah, so complex sentences with multiple subordinate clauses.
Right, lots of commas and nested ideas.
Exactly. It's a language designed for nested logic.
Yeah.
Because X happened while Y was occurring, therefore Z.
It's very architectural.
Yes. Hebrew, on the other hand, relies heavily on parataxis.
Parataxis. So what's the difference there?
It links sequential independent clauses with a simple coordinating conjunction.
Like the word and.
Exactly. Primarily the word and. So it's like, and he went, and he saw, and he spoke, and it was so.
Oh, I see. It's very rhythmic.
Very. So when a translator takes a paratactic Hebrew text and forces it, literally into Greek, you get problems.
It sounds clunky.
Yeah, it results in a very breathless, staccato, clunky Greek that no native speaker would ever organically write.
And Bell and the Dragon has that.
The text of Bell and the Dragon is absolutely saturated with this exact paratactic rhythm.
Okay, so that's the rhythm. But beyond the rhythm, there are actual, mechanical translation errors that expose the underlying Hebrew, right?
Oh, absolutely. There are some huge clues.
I want to explore that specific error regarding the sealed door, because I know we looked at that, and it's a brilliant piece of evidence.
It really is the smoking gun for a Hebrew original.
Okay, lay it out for us.
So in the story, the king orders the temple door to be closed.
Right, simple enough.
But the Greek text oddly uses the word for sealed when the contextual logic of the sentence really demands the word shut.
Wait, closed versus sealed? That's a weird mistake to make.
It is. Now, if you were writing natively in Greek, the word for shut and the word for seal share no visual or phonetic similarities.
So a Greek writer wouldn't confuse them.
Never. You would never confuse them.
But in Hebrew, the visual difference is, it's almost microscopic, isn't it?
Exactly. In Hebrew, the word for shut is satam.
Satam, okay.
And that begins with the letter samek. But the word for seal is chatma,
Chatam.
which begins with the letter het.
And those letters look similar.
In the script used during this era, a samek and a het look remarkably similar. I mean, it is essentially the difference of a single tiny pen stroke.
Just one tiny stroke.
Yeah. So it is incredibly probable that a Greek translator, working under low light with an ancient scroll, simply misread the same mek as a het.
That makes total sense. They just misread the handwriting.
Right. They translated shatam instead of setam.
Wow.
These tiny forensic breadcrumbs, the linguistic ash on the floor, if you will, prove we are dealing with a Jewish text originally composed in the language of its people.
Linguistic ash. I like that. We're going to get to some actual ash very soon.
No, we definitely are.
But before we get to the sting operation, let's unpack the cultural pressure here.
Good idea. Context is everything.
Right, because the author was writing this for a very specific reason. The text places this in the Babylonian court, but the actual target audience was living in the Hellenistic period, right?
Yes, right around the 2nd century BC.
Okay, so the setting is historical Babylon, but the psychological landscape is the Hellenistic diaspora.
Exactly. Think about the Jewish communities living in places like Alexandria or Antioch at that time.
Okay.
Following the conquest of Alexander the Great, the borders of the known world didn't just become physically fluid, they became intellectually fluid.
Everything was mixing.
Yeah, Alexander's project wasn't just geographical domination, it was cultural homogenization.
Right. He wanted everyone to be Greek.
Basically, he exported a comprehensive way of life, the gymnasium, the philosophy, the pantheon.
And this is what we call religious syncretism.
Exactly.
But let's not treat syncretism as just a clinical academic term for, blending. Because in reality, living under syncretism is immense, crushing psychological pressure.
Yo, absolutely crushing.
It's not just moving to a new city and trying the local food. I try to think of it like an analogy.
Okay, let's hear.
Imagine working inside an immense, inescapable global monopoly.
Like a massive tech company or something.
Right. And the culture of this monopoly demands that you not only participate in their systems, but that you fully adopt their ethos.
You have to drink the Kool-Aid.
You have to drink the Kool-Aid. If you don't wear the badge, if you don't chant the corporate mantra, you aren't just denied a promotion. You are viewed as fundamentally antisocial.
You're a threat to the culture.
Exactly. You are erased.
That captures the stakes perfectly. Because the Hellenistic culture didn't necessarily demand that the Jewish people just stop worshiping their god.
They didn't.
No. The pressure was far more insidious than that. The prevailing attitude was, your god is great, we respect him. Just put a statue of him right here next to Zeus and Marduk.
Just add him to the collection.
Right. Why are you being so exclusive? Why are you being so difficult?
Well, that is insidious. Just play along. What's the big deal?
Exactly. So the text of Bel and the Dragon wasn't written as an evangelistic tool to convert Gentiles.
It wasn't for the outsiders.
No, it is an internal piece of protest literature.
Protest literature.
Yeah, it is a polemic aimed directly at fellow Jews who were exhausted by the friction of standing out.
They were just tired.
Very tired. And they were tempted to just assimilate, to quietly bow to the local idols in order to just survive socially and economically.
And the author chooses to frame this protest in a very specific way, because the antagonist isn't a violent, bloodthirsty tyrant, right? At least not initially.
Right, not at first.
The king, who's identified variably as Astyages or Cyrus, depending on the version, is actually quite fond of Daniel.
They're buddies, in a way.
They are. They're having these highly intellectual, almost friendly debates in the royal court. The king basically puts his arm around Daniel and says, "Look at how magnificent our god Bel is."
Look at what he consumes.
Yeah, why won't you just participate?
Yeah.
It's assimilation wrapped in high society logic.
Which brings us to the first great confrontation, right? The idol of Bel, representing the god Marduk.
Yes, the big showdown.
And the king's primary argument for the divinity of Bel is entirely based on the sheer scale of the resources the idol commands.
The logistics of this are staggering. I mean, let's really look at what the text says the Babylonians are providing for this statue every single day.
It's a lot.
It's 12 measures of fine flour, 40 sheep, and 6 firkins of wine, which translates to roughly 54 gallons every single day.
We really need to pause and recognize the economic reality of that offering.
It's absurd.
40 sheep a day is 14,600 sheep a year.
Wow. Over 14,000 sheep.
This isn't a symbolic religious gesture. This is an industrial-scale extraction of wealth.
It's a massive tax on the populace.
Exactly. But the king's logic is painfully pragmatic. He thinks an institution that can command and consume this level of societal wealth must, by definition, be divine.
Because normal things don't eat 40 sheep.
Right. The sheer gravity of the consumption proves its power. So the king looks at the empty table every morning and says to Daniel, "How can you deny this? The God is living. The evidence is right in front of you."
And Daniel's response is what makes this text a masterpiece. He doesn't cower. He doesn't launch into a theological sermon.
He definitely doesn't do that.
And he doesn't pray for a lightning bolt from heaven to strike the temple either.
No. What does he do?
He laughs. He literally laughs in the face of the emperor and says, "Do not be deceived, O king. This thing is clay on the inside and bronze on the outside."
I love that. And a quick note on the metallurgy there, because precision really matters in these texts.
Oh, right, the bronze versus brass thing.
Yeah. Older English translations, like the King James, often render it as brass, but the underlying Greek word refers to bronze.
Okay, why does that matter?
Well, brass is an alloy of copper and zinc, and it wasn't widely standardized until much later. The imagery here is of a hollow bronze shell built over a heavy clay core.
So it's heavy but hollow.
Yes, a literal manifestation of the phrase having feet of clay.
Ah, I see.
It looks impenetrable on the surface, but its foundation is dirt.
That's a great visual. Well, the king does not appreciate the laughter.
I imagine not.
No, he is enraged that his empirical evidence is being mocked. So he summons the 70 high priests of Bel and lays down a terrifying ultimatum.
High stakes.
Very high. He says, if you cannot tell me who is consuming this vast fortune, you will all be executed.
Right.
But you can prove conclusively that Bel himself is eating it, then Daniel dies for blasphemy.
It's the wager is set.
It is.
And this is where Daniel's methodology profoundly separates this narrative from almost any other piece of ancient religious literature.
Because he doesn't go the supernatural route.
Exactly. As you pointed out, Daniel doesn't ask God for a supernatural intervention.
He asks for ashes.
He asks for ashes.
Yes.
He approaches the entire theology of Babylon like a crime scene investigator.
It's ancient CSI. I want to walk through the mechanics of this sting operation step by step, because the genius really is in the mundane details.
Let's break it down.
So the 70 priests are completely unbothered by the king's threat.
They're not sweating at all.
Not a bit. And the text explicitly tells the reader why. They have constructed a series of hidden trapdoors underneath the offering table.
A classic trick.
Right. They know the house always wins because they built the house.
Right. So the priests confidently leave the temple, and the king personally oversees the laying out of the massive feast.
All those sheep, all that wine.
And the heavy bronze doors are about to be shut. But Daniel, out of sight of the priests, brings out his secret weapon. He has his servants lightly scatter fine wood ashes across the entirety of the temple floor.
Just a nice, even layer of ash.
Exactly. Then they exit, the doors are shut, and the king seals the locking mechanism with his signet ring.
So we have the ultimate locked room mystery.
We do.
And the text tells us exactly what happens next. In the dead of night, the 70 priests, accompanied by their wives and their children, use the subterranean trapdoors.
The whole family comes along.
It's a banquet. They emerge into the dark temple, they butcher and eat the 40 sheep, they drink the 54 gallons of wine, and they slip back beneath the floorboards.
A very successful night for them.
For the thing.
Right. So when morning breaks, the king and Daniel arrive at the temple.
The king must be nervous.
Oh, he is anxious. He inspects the seal on the door. It is perfectly intact.
The same in the het, right? The seal is unbroken.
Exactly. The locking mechanism hasn't been tampered with. So he throws open the heavy doors, looks at the completely barren table, and he experiences this moment of profound, triumphant vindication.
He thinks he won.
He shouts, "Great art thou, O Bel, and with thee is no deceit at all."
Talk about speaking too soon. The king thinks he has absolute empirical proof. The doors were sealed, the resources vanished, therefore the system is legitimate.
But Daniel stops the king before he can even step over the threshold.
He points to the floor.
He points to the floor. The pristine layer of fine ash is covered, edge to edge, in hundreds of footprints.
Men, women, and children.
Yes. The invisible architecture of the fraud is suddenly illuminated by the most basic, mundane material on Earth. Ash.
The psychological collapse of the king in that moment must be total.
It's absolute. I mean, the intact seal on the door, the very thing he thought proved the miracle, was actually the very thing protecting the fraud.
You kept people from looking too closely.
Exactly. He realizes that the untouchable divine institution of Bel was nothing more than an elaborate mechanism for a powerful bureaucratic class to gorge themselves at the empire's expense.
It's just a tax scheme.
Yes. And in a fury, he orders the execution of the 70 priests and their families.
Brutal, but standard for the time.
And he hands the hollow bronze idol over to Daniel, who shatters it and levels its temple.
Wow. So that brings us to the core wisdom of this first section. When we translate this ancient locked room mystery into a 21st century reality, what is the author actually demanding of us? Like, what are our modern bills?
That's the real question, isn't it? The enduring insight here is about the nature of power, consumption, and illusion.
Okay, say more about that.
The text is teaching us that if a system, an institution, or a philosophy requires a massive, unceasing, gluttonous input of your resources merely to sustain the illusion of its own power, it is a hollow idol.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Furthermore, it warns that human deception almost always cloaks itself in the terrifying, unquestionable authority of a dominant cultural institution.
Right? The priests didn't have weapons.
No. The priests were able to extract that wealth not because they were violent, but because they hid behind a facade that society had mutually agreed was too sacred to question.
The living God facade.
Exactly.
So if you are listening to this and you're analyzing your own life, your own career, or your own society, you have to look for the invisible trapdoors.
You really do.
Because our modern bells aren't statues demanding butchered sheep. Our bells are ideological frameworks, corporate structures, and algorithmic architectures that demand absolute compliance and continuous sacrifice.
Yes.
Think about, a hypertoxic corporate culture.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
One that demands your weekends, your health, and your family time, all while promising this profound sense of purpose and changing the world.
A promise it structurally cannot deliver.
Right. It's clay on the inside.
Or consider the architecture of the modern attention economy.
Oh, the algorithms, yes.
The algorithms powering our digital platforms are perfectly analogous to the idol of Bel.
How so?
They demand a staggering daily sacrifice of your most precious resources. Your time, your focus, your psychological well-being, and your behavioral data.
And we just feed it to them.
We feed these platforms endlessly because we are told they are the lifeblood of modern connection. They're the living gods of relevance.
But behind the screen?
Hidden beneath the metaphorical table are the modern priests.
The tech conglomerates.
The tech conglomerates and data brokers who are silently harvesting that immense wealth for their own benefit while you are left with an empty table.
You're left with brain fog and zero free time.
Exact.
That is exactly it. The outward appearance is polished bronze. It looks sleek, it looks powerful and inevitable. But the inward reality is brittle clay.
So true.
So how do we actually apply Daniel's methodology today? I think the practical application here is what we can call the ash test.
The ash test. I like that.
Daniel didn't attempt to fight the 70 priests in hand-to-hand combat. He didn't try to out-argue the king regarding Babylonian theology. He simply changed the environment so that the hidden reality would leave a trackable footprint.
Right. Scattering the ashes is a profound practice of radical empiricism.
Empiricism.
It means you stop listening to the marketing of the institution and you start rigorously tracking the actual tangible outcomes.
Oh, give me an example.
Okay, if you are deeply invested in a particular career path that claims to offer fulfillment, scatter some ash. Keep a rigorous private ledger of your actual stress levels, your actual hours worked, and the tangible rewards returned to you over, say, 6 months.
And see if it matches the marketing.
Exactly. Or if you are devoted to a specific political ideology that claims to possess the sole truth, scatter some ash. Look objectively at the actual policies implemented and their material effects on the vulnerable, rather than just absorbing the lofty rhetoric.
You are looking for the footprints of reality to expose the trapdoor. A vital reflection for anyone listening to this is to examine the intact seals in your own life.
The intact seals.
Yeah, the king saw the unbroken seal on the door and immediately stopped thinking critically. He assumed that because the system was closed and functioning smoothly, it must be legitimate.
We do that all the time.
We do. What systems in your life do you accept simply because the seal looks intact? Are you assuming a financial system, a technological habit, or a social hierarchy is healthy just because everyone else is doing it and the door appears locked?
Right.
Or are you willing to look at the floor and ask where the resources are actually going?
The intact seal is really the ultimate metaphor for unchallenged assumptions.
It is.
The greatest trick an exploitative system can play is convincing you that investigating its mechanics is a form of blasphemy.
Wow. Yes.
Daniel's radical act was refusing to treat the mechanism of power as sacred.
He wasn't afraid to look behind the curtain, or under the table, I guess.
Exactly.
So Daniel dismantles the fraud of Bel. The king's first argument is completely annihilated. But the pressure to assimilate doesn't end there. The king pivots entirely. And this brings us to the second half of the text, which presents a fundamentally different kind of challenge.
Right.
The dragon.
The narrative shift here is crucial. The king realizes he cannot defend a hollow statue anymore.
The bronze and clay trick is busted.
Right. So he abandons the illusion of Bel and takes Daniel to see a great living dragon.
A living dragon.
Or, as the Greek word drak often implies in this context, a massive, terrifying serpent that the Babylonians actively revere.
Okay, so a giant snake or reptile.
Yes. And the king's new argument is deeply visceral. He says to Daniel, you cannot use your forensic logic on this.
No ash test for this one.
Right. You cannot say this is a piece of bronze and clay. Look at it. It respires. It eats. It drinks. It is empirically, undeniably alive, and it is capable of destroying you. Therefore, you must worship it.
That is a massive upgrade in the threat level. I mean, we aren't dealing with a hidden tax or a bureaucratic fraud anymore. We are dealing with an apex predator.
A literal monster.
Now, historically, was snake worship actually a phenomenon in this region, or is this purely a literary device?
Oh, no, it was a very real historical and cultural reality.
Really?
Yes. The archaeological and textual evidence for ophiolatry, which is snake worship, in the ancient Near East is abundant.
Ophiolatry.
Yes. In the Sumerian and Babylonian pantheons, you find deities like Sarah, a serpent god. And various major gods were often depicted accompanied by massive coiled serpents.
What did the serpents represent?
They usually represented both fertility and primeval danger. The serpent was like a localized embodiment of something far larger and more terrifying.
Which leads right into the massive scholarly debate surrounding what this dragon actually represents on a mythological level, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Because many historians draw a direct line between this living dragon and the Babylonian epic of creation, the Enuma Elish.
They do. The dominant academic theory for a long time has been that the dragon in this text is a localized earthly representation of Tiamat.
Tiamat. Remind us who that is.
Tiamat is the primordial chaos monster from Babylonian myth. In the Enuma Elish, the hero god Marduk, who is Bel, slaughters Tiamat.
Okay.
And Tiamat represents the terrifying, chaotic, formless ocean of the beginning of time. By slaying Tiamat, Marduk creates order in the physical universe.
But not all scholars agree that the dragon Daniel faces is meant to be a literal stand-in for Tiamat, do they?
No, and this is where rigorous textual scholarship demands nuance. You can't just lump it all together.
Right.
The prominent biblical scholar R.H. Charles fiercely disputed the Tiamat connection.
What was his argument?
Charles pointed out that in the original Akkadian texts, Tiamat is almost never explicitly described as a serpent or a dragon.
She's an ocean, right?
Right, she is a personification of the saltwater abyss. Furthermore, the Babylonian word Tiamat is never directly translated into Greek as drak.
Oh, so the terminology doesn't match up.
Exactly. So while equating the dragon directly with Tiamat might be academically sloppy, Charles and others acknowledge that the mythological resonance is identical.
The feeling is the same.
Yes. Whether it is a literal snake or a symbolic chaos monster, The dragon represents the primal, chaotic, terrifying forces of the universe that threaten to swallow human order.
So the king's demand is essentially bow to the chaos because the chaos can kill you.
That's the threat.
And Daniel accepts the challenge to defeat this living god. But the way he goes about it is, frankly, it's bizarre.
It is very weird.
He makes a very specific contractual request of the king. He asks for permission to slay the dragon, but stipulates that he will do it without a sword or a staff.
Right.
He explicitly renounces the use of traditional weapons.
Which is an immediate subversion of the entire dragon-slaying archetype.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Usually you want a bigger sword for a dragon.
Yeah.
So what is his weapon? The text says Daniel takes pitch, fat, and hair.
Pitch, fat, and hair.
He boils these three ingredients together, forms them into lumps or cakes, and he physically feeds them to the dragon.
Like terrible meatballs.
Terrible meatballs. The dragon swallows this congealed mass, and the text says it bursts asunder from the inside out. It just explodes. Yeah. Daniel then turns to the terrified Babylonian crowd and mocks them, saying, "Look at the gods you worship."
He really rubs it in.
He does. But this is the moment in the text that forces us to pause and ask some very hard questions.
Okay, like what?
I really struggle with the mechanics of this. If Daniel represents the faithful, rational man relying on the ultimate truth of his God, why does he use a recipe of garbage?
It's a fair question.
If the goal is to prove divine superiority, why doesn't he just pray and have the dragon struck by a localized earthquake or a lightning bolt? And practically speaking, how does boiling pitch and hair cause a giant reptile to explode?
Those are exactly the right questions, because the sheer absurdity of the method is the entire theological point.
Really? The absurdity is the point.
Yes, you have to analyze the ingredients. Pitch is a highly viscous, sticky industrial resin used for waterproofing ships.
Okay.
Fat is heavy organic waste. Hair is keratin. It is fundamentally indigestible by almost any biological system.
It's just a massive indigestible junk.
Exactly. When you ask why Daniel didn't use a sword, you are touching on the genius of the narrative.
How so?
Because if you fight a monster with a sword, you are validating the monster's status as a terrifying, mythic warrior. You are meeting it in the arena of honorable combat.
Oh.
By refusing the sword and the staff, Daniel refuses to grant the dragon the dignity of a mythic battle.
Wow. He strips it of its mythology.
Exactly. And by feeding it pitch, fat, and hair, he is weaponizing the most mundane, gross, indigestible realities of human industry.
That is wild.
The dragon, representing primeval chaos, the thing that demands to consume everything in its path, is finally fed something it cannot process.
It chokes on reality.
Yes. The mythic system attempts to digest unvarnished, mundane reality, and the friction causes the system to rupture. Daniel doesn't kill the monster with magic, he kills it with the profound, fatal dose of the mundane.
He exposes the absolute physical limits of the fear. And that is a staggering insight. I mean, if Bel represents hidden institutional deception, then our modern translation of the dragon is the visceral, undeniable intimidations in our lives.
Right.
The dragon is the loud fear. It's the aggressive bully, the looming catastrophe that demands our psychological surrender simply because it is terrifying and real.
Yes. The king's argument is the argument of every bully and every panic attack.
You must bow to me because I have the capacity to destroy you.
Exactly. The wisdom here is about how we confront intimidation. Intimidation relies entirely on you adopting the aggressor's paradigm of combat.
Right.
If a powerful, toxic individual in your workplace screams at you and you scream back, you have picked up the sword. You've entered their mythic arena, and they will likely defeat you because they are native to the chaos.
So how do we apply the pitch and the hair? What is the practical how-to for defeating a modern dragon?
You defeat it by feeding it something it cannot digest. Absolute, unblinking, mundane reality.
Okay, walk us through that.
You find the pitch and hair. If your dragon is a paralyzing fear of financial ruin that keeps you up at night demanding your psychological worship, you do not fight it with vague, heroic affirmations.
I will be wealthy. I will be fine.
Right. Affirmations are a wooden sword against a dragon.
Okay, so what's the pitch and hair?
You fight it with a spreadsheet.
A spreadsheet. I love that.
Yes. You calculate your exact daily burn rate. You list your liquid assets. You map out a worst-case scenario budget. You feed the chaotic fear a diet of hard, boring, indigestible numbers.
And what happens to the fear?
The fear relies on the myth of infinite catastrophe. When you force it to consume the finite reality of a spreadsheet, the illusion of infinite danger bursts.
It bursts just like the dragon.
Okay.
That is brilliant. I love the application to interpersonal dynamics, too.
Oh, it works perfectly there.
If the dragon is an intimidating, manipulative person who dominates every room and demands your compliance, you don't fight them by trying to out-manipulate them.
No, that never works.
You feed them a calm, boring, impenetrable boundary. When they demand a reaction, you give them a flat, emotionless, no, that won't be possible.
Yes.
You feed their need for chaotic drama with the indigestible reality of your refusal to engage.
Exactly. It causes their architecture of intimidation to collapse because bullies cannot process a lack of fear.
The reflection for this section requires deep honesty for anyone listening. Look at your life and ask, where are you bowing down to something simply because it is loud and demanding?
Right.
Are you worshiping an anxiety, a toxic relationship, or societal panic just because the threat feels empirically real?
It's a tough question to answer.
It is. But remember the profound lesson of the pitch and hare. Just because a threat is alive and capable of causing harm does not mean it is divine, and it absolutely does not mean it is entitled to your worship or your surrender.
Well said.
So this brings us to what should be the triumphant conclusion of the story. Daniel has systematically dismantled the entire Babylonian worldview.
He really has.
He exposed the hidden trapdoors of Bel, proving their systems were fraudulent. He detonated the living dragon, proving their terrors were finite and defeatable.
2 massive victories.
Right. So if this were a standard Hollywood narrative or a conventional fairy tale, this is the moment where the music swells. The Babylonian people should realize they've been liberated from extractive priests and terrifying monsters.
They should be thrilled.
They should cheer, the king should issue a decree honoring truth, and Daniel should be paraded through the streets as a hero. But that is not what happens. The text takes a very dark, incredibly realistic turn, presenting us with a massive obstacle to growth.
It really does. The reaction of the populace is not gratitude. It is apocalyptic rage. Apocalyptic rage, yes. The Babylonians gather into a furious mob and march on the royal palace.
They riot.
They are rioting, and their chant is deeply political and xenophobic. They shout, "The king has become a Jew, he has overthrown Bel, he has slain the dragon, and he has slaughtered the priests."
So they turn on the king.
Yes, the mob issues a direct existential threat to the emperor. Deliver Daniel to us, or we will destroy you and your entire house.
And the king, the most powerful man in the world, who has just been given empirical proof that Daniel is right and the Babylonian systems are false, completely capitulates.
He folds entirely.
He caves to the mob's pressure, hands Daniel over, and the mob throws Daniel into a subterranean den containing 7 lions.
It's a terrifying reversal of fortune.
We have to unpack the psychology of this backlash. Why do the people react with such violent, homicidal anger toward the man who just proved their gods were exploiting them? I mean, why do they want to kill their liberator?
Because human beings possess a profound, almost biological aversion to having their foundational worldviews shattered.
Cognitive dissonance.
Massive cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
When Daniel exposed Bel and killed the dragon, he wasn't just winning a philosophical debate in a vacuum. He was detonating the entire socioeconomic and psychological foundation of their society.
Oh, the economy of it.
Exactly. Think back to the 40 sheep a day.
Right, the 14,000 sheep a year.
The Temple of Bel was a massive economic engine. The rhythm of feeding the gods, the festivals, the hierarchy of the priests. This gave the Babylonians their sense of order, their jobs, and their place in the universe.
It was their whole lives.
When Daniel reveals that the core of their society is a lie, he creates an intolerable level of cognitive dissonance. The people are suddenly forced to confront the fact that they have been fools, giving their wealth to a bronze shell.
And rather than face the humiliation of their own gullibility, they turned their rage on the mirror that showed them the truth.
Exactly. It is far easier to violently destroy the truth teller than it is to dismantle the architecture of your own life and start over.
That is so true.
People will fiercely protect the illusions that enslave them if those illusions provide a sense of predictability and comfort.
This is a profound countercultural warning for anyone listening today, because modern culture is saturated with narratives that romanticize disruption.
Oh, yeah, disrupt everything.
We are constantly told to speak your truth, to be a whistleblower, to smash the idols of toxic systems, with the implicit promise that if you expose the truth, you will be celebrated as a visionary.
But that's rarely how it actually plays out.
No. This ancient text offers a much harsher, more realistic assessment of human nature. If you actually have the courage to scatter the ashes, if you expose the fraud in your company, if you call out the toxic dynamic in your family, if you publicly dismantle a comfortable societal illusion, do not expect a parade.
Expect the mob.
Expect the mob. The obstacle to growth is the realization that acting with ultimate integrity might not result in applause. It might result in you being thrown to the lions by the very people you were trying to help.
That's a sobering thought. And this transition into the lion's den introduces one of the most jarring, surreal, and heavily debated literary interpolations in the entire biblical corpus.
The Habakkuk incident.
The Habakkuk incident.
I have been waiting to talk about this because from a narrative standpoint, it feels completely unhinged.
It really does.
Set the scene. Daniel is sealed in the lion's den, and the text specifies he is down there for 6 days.
6 days.
Now, these are not normal, docile zoo animals. The text explicitly notes that these 7 lions are accustomed to a daily diet of 2 human bodies, presumably condemned criminals, and 2 sheep.
They're man-eaters.
But to maximize Daniel's suffering, the mob orders that the lions be starved. They are fed nothing, guaranteeing they will be ravenous and aggressive. Yet for 6 days, the lions refuse to touch Daniel.
A miracle in itself.
Right. But by the 6th day, the supernatural protection doesn't solve a very biological problem.
Daniel is starving.
Daniel is starving to death in the dark.
Right. And meanwhile, the narrative suddenly smash cuts to Judea, hundreds of miles away across the desert.
Like a movie cut?
Exactly. And we are introduced to the prophet Habakkuk. He is engaging in the most mundane domestic activity imaginable.
He's making lunch.
Yes. He has just boiled a large bowl of pottage, which is like a thick peasant stew. He's broken some bread into it, and he is walking out to the fields to deliver lunch to his farm laborers.
Just a normal Tuesday for Habakkuk.
Exactly. And out of nowhere, an angel of the Lord physically manifests in front of Habakkuk and issues a directive. Take the dinner you are holding, go to Babylon, and give it to Daniel in the lion's den.
And Habakkuk's response is incredibly relatable.
Oh, it is.
He essentially says, Lord, I have never even seen Babylon. I have no idea where the lion's den is. I am just bringing lunch to my workers.
He's like, can you ask someone else?
I'm busy. So what happens?
Well, Angel's solution to this logistical problem is pure, unapologetic mythology.
There we go.
The angel physically grabs Habakkuk by the hair on the crown of his head.
Ouch.
Through the blast of a spirit wind, the angel instantly teleports Habakkuk hundreds of miles through the air, dropping him precisely over the opening of the lion's den in Babylon.
Just drops him in.
Habakkuk yells down into the pit, Daniel, take the dinner God has sent you.
Delivery.
Daniel eats the stew, offering a profound prayer of gratitude that God has not forsaken those who love him. And the moment Daniel is finished, the angel grabs Habakkuk by the hair again and instantly teleports him back to his field in Judea.
Okay, I have to be completely honest here, and I know many listeners reading this text will feel the exact same way. This scene breaks the tone of the narrative entirely.
It absolutely does. Tonal whiplash.
The entire first half of the story, Daniel scattering the ashes, analyzing the footprints, boiling the pitch, is a gritty, grounded, forensic thriller celebrating human rationality.
Very grounded.
And suddenly, we are in a cartoon where a prophet is being flown across the Middle East by his hair to deliver the bowl of soup.
Right.
How on earth are modern rational listeners supposed to engage with this? Do we just dismiss it as ancient science fiction?
Your reaction is exactly why scholars overwhelmingly agree that the Habakkuk sequence is a later interpolation.
Meaning someone added it later.
Yes, it's a piece of folkloric legend that was grafted into the core narrative over time. The tonal whiplash is undeniable.
But it's there for a reason, right?
Exactly. As guides to the wisdom of the text, our job is not to get bogged down in the literal mechanics of a levitating prophet. We have to ask, why did the later editors feel the specific surreal imagery was absolutely necessary to complete the theological message of the story?
What is the underlying truth they were trying to communicate? Because it has to mean something.
The truth is about the nature of isolation and providence.
Okay.
When you do the right thing, when you scatter the ashes and defeat the dragons, you will often find yourself exiled in the lion's den.
Alone in the dark.
Yes. You will be cut off from your community, starving, surrounded by threats, and entirely alone. The Habakkuk story is a vivid, surrealist metaphor for the fact that when you are in that place of absolute, principled isolation, sustenance can arrive from the most unimaginable, distant, and illogical sources.
Whether you view it through a theological lens as the grace of God, or through a secular lens as the unexpected resilience of the human spirit, or the sudden intervention of a stranger.
Precisely. And the specific detail of the meal is vital.
The pottage. The stew.
Right. It is not manna from heaven. It is a humble, home-cooked bowl of peasant stew brought directly from the homeland that Daniel was exiled from.
Oh, it's a taste of home.
Yes. It represents the profound idea that even when you are trapped in the deepest dungeon of the empire, surrounded by the apex predators of the culture, the quiet, humble nourishment of your roots, your truth, and your unseen community can cross any distance to keep you alive.
Wow. That reframing completely changes how I view the scene. It moves from being this bizarre magic trick to a really beautiful meditation on hope.
It really is beautiful when you look at it that way.
So Daniel is nourished, and we reach the climax of the narrative. Day 7 arrives.
The big reveal.
The king, who has spent the week presumably eaten alive by guilt for capitulating to the mob, goes to the den to mourn his friend. He looks down into the pit, and there is Daniel, sitting calmly among the starving lions, completely unharmed.
The king is utterly overwhelmed.
He shouts into the pit, praising Daniel's God, publicly declaring that there is no other true power in the universe. He orders his guards to pull Daniel out of the den.
And this is where we collide violently with the harsh reality of ancient texts.
Yes, we do. And I am not going to gloss over this because the ending of this text is deeply problematic for a 21st century reader.
It's very jarring.
The story does not end with a peaceful resolution, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or a decree of religious tolerance. The moment Daniel is pulled to safety, the king rounds up all the political opponents who rioted and accused Daniel.
The mob leaders.
He throws them, along with their families, into the very same den. And the text specifies with brutal efficiency that the starving lions devour them entirely before they even hit the floor of the pit.
It's a bloodbath.
I have to push back hard against the text here. We are trying to extract moral insight and practical wisdom, but this ending feels incredibly vindictive.
It does.
It is a celebration of absolute bloody vengeance. It contradicts every modern ethical standard we have regarding justice, mercy, or the rule of law. How are we as modern readers supposed to process this? Are we supposed to cheer that the mob got torn apart?
No, we are not supposed to cheer. And this is where reading ancient literature requires rigorous discernment.
We have to separate the wheat from the chaff.
Exactly. We have to carefully, surgically distinguish the enduring universal wisdom of the text from the limited, brutal social assumptions of the ancient world in which it was authored.
Okay, so what is the ancient assumption here?
The violent retaliation at the end of the story is not a divine prescription for how modern people should handle conflict resolution. It is a reflection of the ancient Near Eastern concept of justice.
Which was very different from ours.
Completely different. It was entirely based on the geometry of symmetry.
Symmetry.
Yes. The lex talionis, the eye for an eye code.
Right.
In the ancient literary mind, justice is only achieved when the punishment perfectly mirrors the intended crime.
I see.
The accusers intended for Daniel to be unlawfully consumed by lions. Therefore, the universe demands that they be consumed by lions. It is a very common ancient literary trope. The pit you dig for your neighbor is the exact pit you will fall into yourself.
So the enduring wisdom isn't the violence itself. The wisdom is the underlying mechanism the violence represents.
Exactly. We must read the conclusion metaphorically rather than prescriptively.
Okay, lay out the metaphor.
The text is illustrating a profound psychological and spiritual reality. Destructive, malicious intentions ultimately and inevitably consume the people who harbor them.
It eats you alive.
Yes. The hatred, the xenophobia, and the violence the mob tried to weaponize against Daniel was effectively a starving lion they were keeping as a pet.
Wow.
They thought they could direct its violence at their enemy, but the text warns us that malice cannot be controlled. Eventually, the cage breaks, and that kind of hatred turns around and devours the person who feeds it.
So you don't even need to seek revenge.
Right. You do not need to seek revenge against those who wrong you. The nature of deceit and malice is inherently, structurally self-destructive.
That is a crucial distinction that really rescues the text from just being a revenge fantasy. We can absorb the wisdom about the self-destructive nature of hatred without adopting the ancient brutality.
Absolutely.
As we start to pull all these complex threads together and zoom out, I want to look at the legacy of this specific text.
The big picture?
Yes, the big picture. We've dissected the linguistic quirks, the historical pressures, and the philosophical metaphors. But how does Bel and the Dragon resonate with the broader universal themes of human history? How does it connect to other wisdom traditions?
It connects in two profound, almost revolutionary ways. First, let's look at the Bell narrative.
The ash and the footprints.
Yes. The introduction of the detective motif, Daniel using physical evidence, close observation, and logical deduction to disprove a supernatural claim, is a watershed moment in ancient literature.
It's the first locked room mystery.
It is. And think about how radical this is. Almost all other ancient religious texts rely entirely on divine fiat, massive miracles, or the unquestionable authority of a prophet to prove their theology.
Because God said so.
Exactly. But Daniel relies on ash and footprints. This text is a stunningly early argument for the absolute compatibility of faith and reason.
Oh, I hadn't thought of it like that.
It suggests a theology where God does not demand blind, unthinking submission to authority. Instead, it proposes that God gave humanity the tools of intellect, observation, and deduction, specifically so we could see through the illusions of corrupt power.
So you're meant to use your brain.
Yes. It is the birth of forensic rationality within a theological framework.
It's as if Daniel is a proto-Enlightenment thinker operating in Babylon. He demystifies the universe.
He does.
And what about the dragon story? How does that connect globally?
Well, the dragon-slaying myth is perhaps the most ubiquitous archetype in human storytelling. It appears in almost every major culture.
Every culture has a dragon.
Pretty much. In Greek mythology, you have Apollo defeating the python. In Norse myth, Thor battles Jormungandr.
And we talked about Marduk and Tiamat in Babylon.
Right. And later in Christian folklore, you have St. George and the dragon. In all these traditions, the dragon represents the primordial chaos that threatens to swallow human civilization and order.
But Daniel's version of the myth contains a massive subversive twist.
It is a complete inversion of the trope. In almost every other dragon myth, the hero defeats the monster by matching its violence.
With a bigger sword?
Right. The hero uses a magical sword, an impenetrable shield, or superhuman strength. They fight chaos with heroic violence.
But Daniel refuses the sword.
He refuses the sword. He refuses the armor. He uses pitch, fat, and hair. He uses sheer audacity, rationality, and an unshakable grounding in reality.
So it's not a contest of strength.
No. This represents a profound leap forward in the human narrative. It is the victory of reason and grounded faith over paralyzing mythic superstition.
I love that.
The text is telling the listener that you do not need to be a magical warrior to defeat the chaotic terrors in your life. You do not need a divine weapon.
You simply need to see the chaos for what it is. A finite, biological, mundane thing. And refuse to grant it the power of a god.
Yes.
That is incredible. You don't need a magic sword. You just need the audacity to see reality clearly and the courage to feed the fear, a dose of the mundane.
Pitch and hair.
Pitch and hair. This deep dive has covered immense ground.
We really went everywhere.
We did. We've gone from the suffocating psychological pressure of assimilation in Hellenistic culture to the ingenious low-tech use of ash to expose the hidden trapdoors of institutional theft.
The broken seals.
Right. We've explored the necessity of feeding pitch and hair to the visceral dragons of our anxiety, and we've reckoned with the bitter truth that destroying societal illusions might earn you a place in the lion's den rather than a parade.
The mob will come for you.
And through it all, we've seen how isolation can be pierced by unexpected providence, a bowl of peasant stew, and how the malice of our enemies is ultimately a self-devouring beast.
It's all connected.
It is. We've unpacked the ancient mechanics of this text, but the goal was always to bring it into the present. So I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to chew on as you step away from this discussion and back into the architecture of your own life.
Give it to them.
Look closely at the dominant systems, the undeniable fears, and the unquestioned institutions that surround you. The ones demanding your time, your money, your emotional bandwidth, and your unquestioning loyalty.
The ones that demand 40 sheep a day.
Exactly. The ones where the doors are shut, the seals are intact, and everyone around you is bowing down. What if the greatest act of courage in the 21st century isn't fighting a loud physical battle? What if it isn't picking up a sword and screaming into the chaos? What is it then? What if the bravest thing you can possibly do is simply having the quiet audacity to scatter some ashes on the floor, wait for the dawn, and refuse to bow to the illusions that everyone else accepts as reality? That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.